Thank you, Las Concorda. It is utterly deplorable that the British Government have made a unilateral decision to abandon the Stormont House Agreement. As we know, that was a solemn agreement made between the British and Irish governments and the political parties represented in Stormont. I believe that agreement had the capacity to make progress in dealing with the very, very important and very sensitive issues. Progress on legacy has been delayed for far, far too long, and it is indeed a retrograde step that the British have proposed legislation that is totally unacceptable to replace the Stormont House Agreement. Thank you, Las Concorda.
Yeah, I think I'm taking two questions here, so might give you a bit of extra latitude if that's all right.
It's on the clock.
Sorry?
Yeah, you've got it on the clock.
Yeah, we have, yeah, thanks. Yeah. The second question is from Pauline Tully. So, I met with the Secretary of State most recently on the 2nd of November, and the progress of the UK's Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Bill was one of the topics discussed. In all of our discussions, I have been very frank in my view that this bill, as it stands, is not fit for purpose. It represents a clear move away from the Stormont House Agreement. There is near universal opposition to this bill in Northern Ireland, including from the 5 main political parties, those representing victims, their families and survivors, as well as a wide range of other groups. The Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission have expressed serious concern about the bill, as has the UK Parliament's own Joint Committee on Human Rights. The Government has serious doubts about whether this bill is compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. We have raised our profound concerns about this bill directly with the British Government at official and political level, and in the relevant multilateral fora, including the Council of Europe, and most recently at the Universal Periodic Review of the UK by the UN Human Rights Council. Chief among those concerns is that the bill provides for the granting of immunity by the proposed Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery for gross violations of human rights, and the remarkably low threshold for the granting of this immunity. The proposed immunity has profoundly upset families, with many believing that this legislation would protect the perpetrators and denies victims a path to truth and justice, particularly when evidence may exist. The bill provides for the proposed Independent Commission to conduct reviews rather than investigations of legacy cases. The status of these reviews, the significant powers invested in the Commission and the Chief Commissioner, and the role of the Secretary of State raise questions of the independence and all remain matters for serious concern. Under the proposed legislation, all criminal investigations and inquests that are not at an advanced stage and civil actions would also cease. The Government will remain fully engaged on this issue. I have discussed the issue with political parties in Northern Ireland, and in my recent engagements with senior US politicians in Washington, DC. I also recently met with the Northern Ireland Commission for Victims and Survivors and members of Victims and Survivors Forum. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has indicated that he is open to addressing concerns raised about the bill and to increased engagement with all stakeholders. It was agreed at the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference in October that officials would meet to discuss the main elements of concern. However, I have been clear that any amendments would need to be radical and fundamentally change the substance of this bill for it to meet our concerns. The Government is aware of calls for consideration of the initiation of an interstate case against the United Kingdom before the European Court of Human Rights in relation to this piece of legislation. Any future examination by the European Court of Human Rights as to whether this bill, if enacted, is compliant with the United Kingdom's obligation under the European Convention on Human Rights will depend on the precise terms of the legislation as enacted and the factual circumstances pertaining at the time. In this light, a decision as to the referral of an interstate case to the court by Ireland concerning the bill, which remains subject to amendment, is, in the Government's assessment, premature. The Government, however, continues to keep this matter under review. The Government's approach to legacy and reconciliation has always been that it should be a victim-centred approach taken the Stormont House Agreement as its starting point, a process that was agreed by both governments and most political parties in Northern Ireland with the support of victims and survivors groups. Can I just finally say on this, and I'll be short in my final answer. I have had, I think, a constructive discussion with the new Secretary of State on this issue. I don't know whether it will be possible for us to come to an agreement in relation to amending and changing this legislation fundamentally. But what I would say is, on an issue as sensitive as legacy and the trauma and pain that it is linked to for so many thousands of families, this is something that the two governments, working with parties in Northern Ireland and with victims groups, should try and agree a common approach together on. Unilateral action, moving ahead without the support of virtually anybody, in my view, is a real mistake by the British government if they choose to do it. But I do want to welcome the conversations I've had with Secretary of State Heaton Harris, who has shown a willingness to looking at possible change, and I hope that will be possible.
Thank you, Oireachtas Comhairle. I thank the Minister for his reply, and I welcome the Government's ongoing strong opposition to this deplorable piece of legislation. It has united all the political parties on this island, all advocacy groups and all groups who have worked with victims over the years. As the Minister quite rightly said, it's perpetrator-focused, it's not victim-centred. And when we deal with legacy issues, we will not successfully deal with legacy issues unless it's victim-centred, and it has to be victims-focused. I welcome the statements by the Archbishops of Armagh recently, where they made a very cogent and strong argument against the legislation. So we literally have in this British proposal are that perpetrators of heinous crimes, be them murderers from paramilitary organisations or murderers from the British state forces, that they can give themselves an amnesty from the most heinous crimes, including murders, bombings and maimings of innocent people. Any legislation that proposes such an amnesty for people to give themselves cannot be accepted. Thank you, Oireachtas Comhairle.
No, Deputy, I agree with that, I have been holding the line on this issue because I believe that not to do that would be to dishonour the commitments that we have made to victims on all sides. I have repeatedly said to victims' families that we cannot support legislation that shuts off the opportunity to take a case should there be an evidence base that allows for that to happen in the future. The idea that we would effectively be introducing an amnesty so that people who perpetrated awful crimes could potentially talk about that, write about that, glorify those actions in the future, and have no possibility of a case being taken against them. How is that protecting victims, and how is that helping Northern Ireland to move on into a period of reconciliation?
Thank you.
Again, I would appeal to, and I do this privately as well as publicly, to the British government to work with us on this. We will try to accommodate some of their concerns, but they do need to listen to victims in particular.
Minister, I appreciate your very, very strong words again, and I want to commend the work of Joanne Cherry MP and the MPs and the members of the House of Lords in their very, very strong condemnation of the British government proposals. Minister, you will recall that we had many discussions in private and many discussions in this House and a committee in regard to the Dublin Monaghan bombings of 1974, the terrible Belturbet bombing of December 1972 in my own constituency, where 2 young innocent teenagers were murdered. I have campaigned along with families for decades to get the truth. People have gone about with great grace and dignity to try to get the truth about who carried out murders and serious crimes against their loved ones. Under no circumstances could any democratic government put a proposal to families: you now abandon everything that you fought for over the years and over the decades, sometimes nearly up to 50 years, a half a century nowadays. Minister, I want the government to continue its strong opposition to such, and we cannot accept a situation where you would have murderers given a de facto amnesty. The bill should be dropped entirely, go back to the Stormont House Agreement that has the potential to deal with the issues that the campaigners for justice, for the Dublin Monaghan families and for the Belturbet families that we all want to assist. Thank you, Alaska and Corla.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would like to do is on behalf of the Irish Government to work with the British Government and with victims groups and with political parties to ensure that we could have an approach to legacy that involved the provision of information, the taking of cases that would involve cross-border cooperation on the island and, of course, into Great Britain as well, so that we could respond to many of the concerns expressed by many in the unionist community in terms of the activity of gangs that operated across the border and so on. But if the British Government move ahead with what they're doing, we cannot support it, we will not support it, and we can't on that basis provide the cross-border cooperation that is needed to establish truth and justice for people who are seeking that, where it's possible to do it. So for so many reasons, we need the British Government to rethink their approach in this space. If they do, they'll find the Irish Government will work constructively to help them do it.